Welcome to part 2 of our workshop. In the previous video, we talked about how lack of confidence can result in observable behaviors, and if we can control these observable behaviors, we can invert this arrow and make our behaviors reflect confidence, even if you're not feeling confident when you're speaking. In the second part, we're going to focus on 2 language issues that can contribute to that. One problem that can make us look not very confident is rambling. When you go from piece to piece and then go back to something else and think out loud. Here's what we can do. Think about organization. One way to organize your presentation is think of it like an essay. Remember that in an essay, we're going to have a thesis, which has our main idea and the idea that we want to defend. And then we usually wrap up with a conclusion where we recap that main idea or think about what we can do in the future. That thesis in an essay usually comes in the introduction, so very early on. Same thing in your presentation. You should get to the point early. Have your audience know what you're getting at right away. Say who the killer is before you show how the investigation got to the killer. Something else that can affect organization is when we think out loud, when we put the whole thought process before we get to an answer or before we get to a conclusion. Remember, just like in an essay, in a presentation, your whole thought process to get to a certain conclusion doesn't have to be what you put in that essay. You can rearrange that to make a more logical structure. So instead of thinking out loud, think, what's the most logical and clear way I can present an argument? And that doesn't have to be the way you thought about that argument or the way you got to a certain conclusion. If you're answering a question or you just have an idea that you hadn't planned for, don't ramble. Don't think out loud. Pause if you have to and think about what's the clearest structure that you can present that argument or that thinking. Also, keep in mind how much time you have. If you only have 5 or 10 minutes for a presentation, what's the best use you can make of that time? Think about that when you're organizing what to say. Don't plan for 50 slides if you only have 10 minutes. On the other hand, if you have more time, think about how you can use that time to maybe incorporate pictures, multimedia, or audience participation to make use of the whole time without thinking like you're just stretching. Another language aspect that can make us not sound very confident is what our intonation sounds like. Intonation is mainly the music of language. Here is an example of a monotone. Hi, today I'll show you my new idea. Sometimes when we're not very confident, one thing we do is not vary our pitch very much and everything sounds the same. On the other hand, sometimes we just change it so much because we don't know what to do. So think about what's the optimal way you can use intonation. Intonation is part of what we call suprasegmental features of language. Suprasegmentals are everything that comes on top of the sounds themselves. So for example, using emphasis. How can you emphasize certain words in your sentence? First of all, to make things sound more clear, and second, to make your voice change so you sound more interesting and more engaging. Another aspect of suprasegmentals is using speed, pauses, and silence. Some people, when they're nervous, speak too fast because they want to get to the end of it as soon as they can. Some other people, on the other hand, speak very slowly and pause a lot. So the first thing to do is identify when you sound nervous, when you don't sound very confident, what do you do with your speed and with your pauses? Identify that and see how you can control it to sound more confident. And remember, silence can be your friend. Don't be afraid of silence. Wait. Pause. Let people think about what you're saying. Sometimes when we're preparing and thinking about organization too much, we have a certain list of things we want to say or we have a certain script. This can make us use a certain intonation that makes it sound like we're reading things. This list intonation is what happens when you're trying to remember a list of things. So, try to identify that. If you have a very well-planned presentation, how can you deliver it in a way that doesn't sound like you're reading out of a list or that you're reading out a script? Another issue is something that people call upspeak. That is when you're speaking and everything you say sounds like you're asking a question. You're not, in fact, asking a question. Upspeak can have a very good function. It's about rapport. It's about connecting with your audience. It's almost like saying, right? You see what I mean? Isn't it? It does establish a connection with your audience and can make you sound more approachable. On the other hand, it can also be perceived as insecurity. Certain people have very strong feelings against upspeak. Because of these attitudes, even though there's nothing inherently wrong with upspeak, you got to be careful with it. You got to be mindful of what your audience is expecting and what your audience is perceiving in your speech. And if in that kind of upspeak, an audience will perceive insecurity, that's something you got to watch out for and try to avoid.